The boardroom on the upper floors of one of Alabama's tallest office buildings had gone quiet for the first time that morning. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on Benzos. At 45, he had become the kind of billionaire CEO people studied from a distance and admired without truly knowing. He stood at the front of the room in a tailored suit, discussing expansion plans with the confidence of a man who had spent years convincing people that problems existed only to be solved. A large screen behind him displayed numbers, projections, and maps, highlighting future manufacturing sites across Alabama. "The Huntsville expansion puts us ahead of schedule," Benzos said, clicking to the next slide, "which means if anyone planned to use budget concerns as an excuse to avoid my celebration dinner, I've officially ruined your plans." Polite laughter spread around the conference table. A few executives laughed harder than the joke deserved, because Benzos had told it. He continued speaking. "Our competitors are reacting exactly how we expected. By this time, next quarter," his words stopped. The room shifted. At least, that's what it felt like. Benzos blinked once, twice. The screen behind him blurred. He tightened his grip around the presentation remote. One of the executives leaned forward. "Mr. Benzos?" He ignored the concern. He'd handled pressure before. He'd negotiated million-dollar deals while running on little sleep. He'd survived financial crises. He'd buried stress beneath expensive watches and packed calendars. He straightened his shoulders. "You know," he said, forcing a smile, "I always wanted an excuse to postpone meetings." A few uncertain chuckles floated through the room, but Benzos wasn't looking at them anymore. The polished conference table moved strangely beneath his fingertips. The floor tilted, his heartbeat pounded heavily inside his ears. "Sir," another voice called out, "are you all right?" Benzos opened his mouth. "I think even billionaires deserve a coffee." The sentence never finished. Gasps filled the boardroom. The presentation remote slipped from his hand. His knees gave way. And before anyone could reach him, the most powerful man in the room collapsed onto the floor. For the first time in years, no one saw a billionaire. They saw a man whose body had finally refused to carry burdens his pride never admitted were too heavy. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Our Love, Money, and Secret family stretches across cities, states, and countries, and we'd love to know where you're joining us from. Also, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment. Those small actions help YouTube recommend stories like this to more people who need them. Before we continue, let's take a brief moment to pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for the gift of another day. Teach us not to place our trust only in achievements, titles, or material success while neglecting the people you have placed in our lives. Help us choose humility over pride, love over stubbornness, and forgiveness over resentment. Bless every person listening today. Strengthen those carrying silent burdens and remind them that it is never too late to make things right. In your name we pray. Amen. Welcome to Love, Money, and Secret, where America's greatest stories and life lessons meet creativity and heart. If you're new to the family, we're grateful to have you here. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring more unforgettable stories your way. Hospital monitors beeped steadily. Benzos fought against the heaviness pressing down on him. His eyelids fluttered. His head ached. For a few seconds, he couldn't remember where he was. The sharp scent of antiseptic replaced the smell of polished wood and expensive cologne. The conference room was gone. The presentation was gone. The executives were gone. Slowly, his eyes adjusted. He expected to see assistants standing nearby with updated schedules. Lawyers discussing temporary leadership plans. Board members waiting to reassure him that the company remained under control. Executives eager to prove their loyalty. Instead, someone sat quietly beside his hospital bed. Benzos froze. Lilian, his black ex-wife, the woman he hadn't truly spoken to in years. The woman whose voice had once been the first thing he wanted to hear in the morning. The woman whose absence had become a silence he taught himself to live with. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lilian looked up from the chair. Her eyes met his. "You look terrible," she said calmly. Benzos stared at her. Even now, even lying in a hospital bed, the familiar dryness in her humor found him. "You've always known how to flatter me. You fainted during a meeting. I was trying to avoid paperwork. You almost scared people to death. You mean they postponed the meeting?" Despite herself, Lilian rolled her eyes. A small laugh escaped her. Benzos heard it. That laugh. The one he hadn't realized he'd missed until this very second. Outside the hospital room, nurses moved through the corridor unaware that something far more complicated than medical recovery had just walked back into Benzos' life. Because the biggest shock wasn't that a billionaire had collapsed. It was that when everything else fell away, the first person waiting beside him was the woman he had once promised forever. Benzos couldn't take his eyes off her. Of all the people who could have walked through that hospital door, Lilian made the least sense, and yet she was the only person whose presence immediately quieted the fear he didn't want anyone else to see. He cleared his throat. His voice came out weaker than he expected. "Why are you here?" The question hung between them. It wasn't really about the hospital. It carried years of silence, years of pride, years of conversations that never happened. Lilian lowered her gaze briefly before looking back at him. There was no anger in her expression, no performance, no attempt to pretend the past hadn't hurt. When she finally answered, her honesty struck harder than his collapse. "Because no matter what happened between us," she said softly, "I couldn't pretend you meant nothing." Benzos looked away. For years, people had celebrated his achievements. They applauded quarterly victories. They praised his leadership. They admired the life he had built. But admiration wasn't the same as being known. The people around him knew how he negotiated contracts. Lilian knew how he drank his coffee. The board knew his professional goals. Lilian knew he told jokes whenever he was scared. The world saw a billionaire. She saw the man beneath the title. Have you ever let pride damage something you truly valued? Have you ever convinced yourself there would always be another opportunity to make things right? Another phone call, another dinner, another anniversary, another chance. Until suddenly, life reminds you that tomorrow isn't guaranteed. Success had given Benzos influence, recognition, and wealth, but lying in that hospital bed, he faced a truth he had spent years avoiding. The one person who understood him best wasn't sitting in a boardroom. She was sitting beside his hospital bed. So here's the question that will stay with us throughout this story. Can two people who stopped choosing each other find their way back? Before regret becomes permanent? Because Benzos collapsed believing his greatest achievement was becoming a billionaire. He had no idea that waking up would force him to confront the greatest loss he had never admitted. And this time, walking away from the conversation would no longer be an option. Years earlier, Birmingham, Alabama moved to a different rhythm than the boardrooms Benzos knew so well. That Saturday afternoon, music drifted through a neighborhood. Community center where volunteers arranged folding chairs, children chased each other across the parking lot, and the smell of homemade food tempted everyone passing by. Lilian moved through the crowd with effortless familiarity. She greeted older women by name, checked whether extra drinks had been set aside for the youth mentors, made sure elderly guests had comfortable seats. Someone called her over to settle a playful disagreement about whose sweet potato pie deserved first place. "You know mine won last year," Lilian said, placing one hand on her hip. "It won because people felt sorry for you," someone shot back. Lilian laughed. "You all just hate losing." She carried that warmth everywhere she went. People noticed when she entered a room because she had a way of making others feel seen. Across the parking lot, a sleek black luxury vehicle pulled into a spot that immediately drew curious glances. Benzos stepped out wearing clothes that looked more appropriate for a business luncheon than a neighborhood gathering. His expensive watch caught the afternoon sunlight. He paused. Children sprinted past him without noticing who he was. Someone accidentally brushed against him while carrying trays of food. Nobody rushed over to impress him. Nobody asked for business advice. For one of the few times in his adult life, being Benzos meant absolutely nothing. He looked around, clearly out of place. Lilian noticed immediately. She approached him with amusement dancing in her eyes. "You look like someone dropped you off at the wrong address." Benzos glanced around. "Is it that obvious?" "You've checked your shoes 3 times in 2 minutes?" "I was making sure they survived the parking lot." Lilian smiled. "Those shoes cost more than my first car, don't they?" Benzos hesitated. "Should I answer honestly?" "You just did." For a brief second, silence settled between them. Then Lilian extended her hand. "Relax. Nobody's judging you." Benzos shook it. "I'm Benzos." "Lilian?" He expected curiosity about his success. Instead, she nodded toward the food tables. "You ever eaten at one of these events before?" "Depends." "Depends on what? Will admitting the truth get me laughed at?" Lilian grinned. "Oh, absolutely." For the first time that day. Benzos laughed too, and neither of them realized that a simple conversation in Birmingham would quietly change the course of both their lives. The conversation that started over expensive shoes and community food tables should have ended that afternoon. At least, that was what made sense. Benzos had board meetings, investor calls, and a calendar scheduled weeks in advance. Lilian had church commitments, mentoring programs, family obligations, and neighbors who treated dropping by unannounced as a normal part of life. Their worlds operated differently. Yet somehow, they kept finding reasons to see each other again. A week after the community event, Benzos invited Lilian to dinner. He arrived early. Lilian arrived 5 minutes late. "You own multiple companies," she said as she sat down. "Surely you can survive 5 extra minutes." "I wasn't worried. You checked your watch twice while I was walking over here." "I was confirming it still worked." Lilian laughed. "That's billionaire language for 'I was worried.'" Benzos shook his head. "You've made it your mission to humble me. You needed the service." Their dinners became longer. Their conversations became easier. Lilian challenged him in ways people around him rarely did. She didn't rush to agree with every opinion. She didn't treat his wealth as a personality trait. When he spoke about growth strategies and expansion plans, she listened. When she talked about mentoring teenagers and helping elderly neighbors with grocery runs, he listened too. Months later, Lilian introduced Benzos to one of her family gatherings. It was loud, very loud. People talked over each other. Someone argued passionately about a football game nobody else seemed interested in. Children darted through the house like tiny hurricanes. Music played from the kitchen. Benzos stood near the entrance, trying to process the organized chaos. Lilian noticed his expression. "You look terrified. I'm assessing the situation. You've negotiated $1 million contracts. Contracts don't ask why I'm not eating enough." Almost on cue, an older relative placed another helping of food onto his plate. "You need more." "I'm actually full." "No, you're not." Lilian covered her mouth to stop herself from laughing. "You'll survive," she whispered. "You say that with alarming confidence." He survived. More importantly, he relaxed. He laughed during stories he barely understood. He learned that losing card games resulted in endless teasing. He discovered that family wasn't always quiet affection. Sometimes family sounded like people arguing over recipes while making sure everyone had enough to eat. In return, Benzos introduced Lilian to charity galas and formal dinners. At first, she worried she wouldn't fit in. Instead of criticizing her discomfort, Benzos stayed close. "If anyone makes you uncomfortable," he said softly during one event, "we leave." "You'd leave your own fundraiser?" "I invited you." Lilian looked at him. "You mean that?" "I do." Opposites shouldn't have worked this well. One valued schedules, the other valued spontaneity. One built companies, the other built communities. Yet every difference seemed to teach them something they didn't know they needed. One evening, after dropping Lilian home, Benzos remained seated behind the wheel longer than usual. "Lilian? I've negotiated major business deals with less anxiety than this conversation." She smiled. "That sounds serious." Benzos turned toward her. "I don't know what the future looks like." "I don't either, but I know I want you in it." Lilian's teasing expression softened. "Are you asking me something?" He took a steady breath. "Marry me." For once in his life, the billionaire who always had the right words looked nervous, and Lilian had never found him more lovable. After Lilian said yes, life did not suddenly become perfect, but for a while it felt beautifully possible. Their wedding was warm, emotional, and filled with the kind of laughter Benzos had once been too serious to understand. Lilian looked at him that day like she trusted him with her whole heart, and Benzos held her hands as if he had finally found something success alone could never give him. In the early months of marriage, they built a rhythm that belonged only to them. Benzos still worked long hours, but he came home with effort in his eyes. Lilian would be in the kitchen, sometimes cooking, sometimes pretending she had not ordered takeout and transferred it into real plates. Benzos caught her one evening. "This chicken tastes suspiciously professional," he said. Lilian lifted her chin. "That is called skill. The receipt is still on the counter." She paused. "That is called evidence, and I would like it removed." He laughed, walked over, and kissed her forehead. Those small moments kept their home alive. Friday nights became their quiet tradition. No business calls, no charity, speeches, no crowded rooms full of people trying to impress him, just dinner, music, and conversations that wandered from serious plans to playful arguments. Lilian talked about expanding her youth mentoring work across Birmingham neighborhoods. She wanted young people to have guidance before trouble found them. Benzos listened carefully, not as a billionaire trying to fund something, but as a husband proud of the woman beside him. "You know," he said one night, "we could turn that idea into a real program." Lilian narrowed her eyes. "Do not CEO my dream. I was offering support." "You were about to say strategy?" "I may have thought it," she pointed at him. "Exactly." He smiled. "Fine, I'll listen first. That's better." And he did. For a time, they balanced each other well. She reminded him to slow down. He encouraged her to think bigger. She pulled him into church, events, cookouts, and community meetings. He brought her into board dinners, charity galas, and formal gatherings where her honesty often surprised people who were used to careful smiles. When Benzos' companies began growing faster, Lilian celebrated him. She stood beside him at events, squeezed his hand before speeches, and whispered jokes whenever he looked too stiff. But growth came with demands. A dinner moved from 7 o'clock to 9. A promised weekend became a work emergency. One phone call during breakfast became 3. At first, Lilian understood. "This season is busy," Benzos told her. "I know," she replied, and she meant it. The problem was not one missed dinner. It was how easily love began making room for everything else. Not loudly, not cruelly, just quietly, one small sacrifice at a time. At first, Benzos always apologized. "I'm sorry," he said after missing dinner one evening. The meeting ran longer than expected. Lilian reheated his food. "It's okay," and she meant it. The next time he called ahead. "I'll be late. Drive safely." The time after that, he texted, "Running behind. Don't wait up." Lilian stared at the message before locking her phone. The food she had prepared sat untouched on the table. She wrapped it in containers and placed them in the refrigerator. When Benzos finally arrived home, she was already asleep. He stood beside the bed for a moment. He considered waking her. Instead, he quietly changed clothes and told himself he would make it up. To her tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week. Next week became next month. The missed moments weren't dramatic enough to raise alarms. That was what made them dangerous. One evening, Lilian sat across from him at the dining table. "Do you remember what today is?" she asked. Benzos looked up from his laptop. "Thursday?" Her expression fell for only a second before she recovered. "Our anniversary." The color drained from his face. "Lilian, I know you've been busy. I honestly lost track." "You lost track of us." He immediately closed the laptop. "I'm trying to build something for our future, and I'm trying to be part of your present." Silence filled the room. Neither of them raised their voices. Neither insulted the other. But hurt had a way of settling into places anger couldn't reach. Benzos reached for her hand. "I'll fix this." Lilian let him hold it. "I don't need expensive gifts," she said quietly. "I need you. I am here." She looked at him. "You're home." The distinction hurt more than he expected. As the months passed, Benzos worked harder. The company expanded. More responsibilities arrived. People praised his dedication. Employees admired his discipline. Business magazines celebrated his leadership. Meanwhile, Lilian stopped asking him to attend community events. She stopped reminding him about church activities. She stopped mentioning dinners he would probably miss. Not because she no longer cared, because disappointment had become exhausting. One night, Benzos returned home unusually early. "Lilian?" he called. No answer. He found her sitting alone in the living room. "You've been quiet lately," he said. She gave him a tired smile. "I got tired of competing with your schedule." "You know why I'm doing this." "I know why you started." Her voice remained gentle. "I'm not sure you remember why you're still doing it." Pride entered where vulnerability should have lived. "You think I'm choosing work over you?" "I think I stopped feeling chosen." Benzos looked away. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, to justify. Instead, he said nothing. Lilian waited. When the silence stretched too long, tears gathered in her eyes. "We don't talk anymore," she whispered. Weeks later, they sat across from each other, signing papers neither had imagined needing. No betrayal, no shouting, no dramatic exit. Just two people who once promised forever, realizing they had allowed distance to speak louder than love. When the final signature dried, neither of them celebrated freedom. Because some endings don't happen when love disappears. They happen when people stop reaching for each other. Back in the hospital room, Benzos stared at the ceiling long after. Lilian's words settled between them. He wanted to make another joke. That was his usual escape. Say something clever, make people laugh, move the attention away from whatever hurt. But this time, Lilian sat close enough to notice the fear behind his eyes. "You should rest," she said. "I've rested enough. You woke up 15 minutes ago. That feels like enough." She leaned back in the chair. Still stubborn, still bossy. Somebody has to be, since your body clearly resigned without notice. Benzos gave a weak laugh, then winced slightly. Lilian saw it immediately. "Don't pretend you're fine. I wasn't pretending. You were preparing to—" He looked at her. For years he had sat in rooms full of people who respected him, feared him, needed him, or wanted something from him. But Lilian did not. Speak to him like a billionaire CEO. She spoke to him like the man who once forgot where he parked because he was too busy rehearsing a speech in his head. A nurse stepped in with a small tray. "Good morning, Mr. Benzos. The doctor wants you eating light today." Benzos glanced at the plate. "What is that?" "Steamed vegetables," the nurse said. He looked offended. Lilian folded her arms. "Eat," He pointed weakly at the broccoli. That green thing is aggressive. It is broccoli. It looks like it came here to judge me. The nurse tried not to laugh. Lilian picked up the fork and held it out to him. You own companies across Alabama, but broccoli is where your courage ends. I handle steel plants, payrolls, investors, and board members. Good. Then you can handle a vegetable. Benzos took the fork with dramatic reluctance. If I don't survive this, tell everyone I went down bravely. Lilian shook her head, but the corner of her mouth betrayed her. The nurse smiled before leaving them alone. For a few minutes, the room felt strangely normal. Not easy, not repaired, but familiar. Lilian adjusted his blanket without making a show of it. She checked the water cup beside him. She moved his phone farther away when it kept buzzing on the side table. He noticed. You don't have to stay, he said quietly. I know. You probably had things to do. I did. Then why? Because you scared me. Her answer stopped him. No long speech, no anger, just truth. Benzos lowered his eyes. Lilian looked toward the window, gathering herself. You scared a lot of people, she added. But I don't think you. Understand how serious this is. I collapsed. You collapsed because you kept ignoring warning signs. He swallowed. I thought I was handling it. You always think that. The words were gentle, but they carried history. He knew she wasn't only talking about stress. She was talking about everything he had once tried to manage instead of feel. Before we continue, family, if this story has already touched you, please like this video and leave a comment. Tell us what you would do if someone from your past showed up when you needed help most. Your comments help YouTube share this story with more people, and if you haven't subscribed yet, join the Love, Money, and Secret family. Benzos looked back at Lilian. For the first time since waking up, he did not ask about meetings. He did not ask about the company. He did not ask who had called. He only said, "Thank you for coming." Lilian's face softened. "You're welcome." And in that quiet hospital room, with broccoli still sitting half-finished on the tray, something between them shifted. Not back to love. Not yet, but back to honesty. Later that afternoon, the hospital room settled into a quieter rhythm. The steady sound of medical equipment faded into the background. Lilian sat near the window, flipping through one of the pamphlets the nurses had left behind. Benzos watched her. You don't actually read those, do you? Without looking up, she answered, No. Then why are you pretending? She folded the pamphlet neatly. It keeps me from asking you questions you're not ready to answer. Benzos stared at her for several seconds. You always did that. Did what? Know when I was avoiding something? Lilian finally looked at him. You weren't exactly subtle. He gave a small laugh. Everyone else seemed convinced I had everything under control. Everyone else wasn't married to you. The room grew quiet again. Benzos shifted carefully against the pillows. When they called you. He began slowly. Why did you come? Lilian lowered her eyes. It would have been easier to give a polite answer. It would have been safer to pretend compassion was simple. Instead, she chose honesty. Because I panicked. He blinked. I heard you'd collapsed, and before I could think about pride or old arguments. She paused. I was already grabbing my keys. Benzos swallowed. You could have ignored it. I know. You had every reason to. Lilian's voice softened. I also had every reason to care. Outside the room, 2 employees from Benzos' company stood near the nurses' station. Their voices carried just enough to drift through the partially open door. I thought they hated each other. They're divorced. Then why is she still here? I don't know. Benzos looked away. For years, people had studied his leadership style. They knew what time he arrived at the office. They knew how demanding he could be during negotiations. They knew the value of the companies he owned. Very few knew the man behind the reputation. Lilian noticed when stress made him joke too much. She knew he drank coffee stronger than most people considered. Reasonable. She knew he pretended not to worry so others wouldn't panic. She recognized the tightness in his expression before he admitted he was overwhelmed. She had memorized the details that success never required anyone else to notice. You know something embarrassing? Benzos asked quietly. What? I don't remember the names of half the people who congratulated me at my last business dinner. Lilian smiled faintly. But you remember Mrs. Johnson's sweet potato pie winning 3 years in a row. He looked surprised. That pie was unforgettable. You complained about losing the judging vote for weeks. I maintain there was corruption involved. A small laugh escaped her. Then Benzos became serious again. I spent years surrounded by people. His voice dropped. I've never felt more alone than I did after we signed those papers. Lilian looked at him. This time she didn't interrupt. Didn't correct him. Didn't rush to make the moment lighter. Benzos took a slow breath. I thought success meant being needed. His eyes met hers, but lying in this hospital bed, his voice wavered slightly. I'm Realizing being needed isn't the same as being known. Emotion filled the space between them. For the first time since waking up, Benzos stopped protecting the version of himself everyone admired, and Lilian saw the same man she had fallen in love with years ago. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, just Benzos. A man finally brave enough to admit he had been hurting. Recovery did not happen all at once. The doctors released Benzos with instructions he didn't particularly enjoy. Less stress, more rest, better eating habits, regular checkups. Lilian looked over the paperwork. You know this means you can't pretend to be invincible anymore. Benzos adjusted the discharge papers. I never pretended. Lilian raised an eyebrow. You collapsed in front of an entire boardroom. Fine, he said. I may have exaggerated my durability. You think? The weeks that followed felt unfamiliar. For the first time in years, Benzos wasn't racing from one emergency meeting to another. His mornings became slower. His phone still buzzed constantly, but he no longer answered every notification immediately. One Friday afternoon, Lilian called. Are you busy? Benzos looked at the untouched stack of reports. I don't think I know how to answer that question anymore. Good. The church fish fry starts in an hour, he blinked. You want me to come? I asked if you were busy. You didn't answer my question. Lilian paused. Yes. Something warm settled in his chest. I'll be there. The church parking lot buzzed with familiar energy. Children raced between folding tables. People debated recipes with unnecessary confidence. Music floated through the air. Benzo stepped out of his car and hesitated. Lilian noticed immediately. You've been here before. I know. Then why do you look nervous? I haven't done normal in a while. Lilian smiled. Then we'll start small. She handed him a tray. Congratulations. What is this? Your first assignment. I'm volunteering. You own companies. You've survived board meetings. You can survive serving fish. By the end of the evening, Benzos had learned 3 things. First, church volunteers took organization very seriously. Second, people had strong opinions about tartar sauce. Third, laughter came easier when nobody expected perfection. The following week, Lilian invited him to one of her youth mentoring programs. Benzos expected polite introductions. Instead, teenagers challenged him immediately. What were you like at our age? Did money change you? Were you always this serious? Lilian tried not to laugh. Answer honestly. I regret agreeing to this. You agreed because you're trying, and he was. He listened more than he spoke. He admitted mistakes. He encouraged questions. Days later, he found himself standing beside Lilian at a neighborhood basketball game. Everyone believed they could coach better than the referees, Benzos included. That was clearly a foul. You've never played organized basketball, Lilian reminded him. I understand injustice when I see it. Lilian laughed so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. Benzos looked around. At the cheering families, at the familiar faces, at the woman beside him. Years ago, he had entered this community as an outsider. Now he realized something important. Reconnecting wasn't about being impressive. It was about showing up, again and again, until the people you love no longer question whether you'll be there. A few weeks after the neighborhood basketball game, Benzo stood in front of his closet adjusting his tie. He glanced toward Lilian. You don't have to come. Lilian looked up from fastening her earrings. You've said that 3 times. I'm simply giving you options. You invited me, I know. You asked if I'd attend. I remember. And now you're nervous. Benzos exhaled. I don't want you feeling uncomfortable. Lilian softened. This isn't my first gala. No, it's my first one after everything. He nodded. That distinction mattered. The charity gala buzzed with familiar elegance. People moved through the ballroom carrying polished conversations and practiced smiles. Months ago, Benzos would have walked through the room focused entirely on networking opportunities. Tonight, his attention shifted repeatedly toward Lilian. At first, she stayed close to him. Then something happened. People approached her, not because of Benzos, because of who she was. One guest asked about community mentoring programs. Another wanted advice about volunteer initiatives. Lilian answered thoughtfully, speaking with the same sincerity she used everywhere else. Benzos noticed something else. People listened. During dinner, someone asked Benzos a question about future expansion plans. He started to answer, then paused. Lilian, he said, turning toward her, what do you think? She blinked. About manufacturing? About people. The table grew quiet. Lilian considered her response. If businesses want stronger communities, she said calmly, they have. To remember that success isn't only measured by profit. The the people. Working for you have families, responsibilities, and lives outside those walls. When people feel valued, they invest more than labor. They invest loyalty. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dismissed her. Several people nodded. Benzos smiled quietly. Years ago, he had invited Lilian into these rooms, hoping others would accept her. Now, he realized acceptance had never been the goal. Respect was. And respect couldn't be purchased. It had to be earned. Days later, Benzos invited Lilian to the lake house where business. Associates often gathered on weekends. The atmosphere was more relaxed. People discussed investments over grilled food and conversations that stretched into the evening. Lilian stood beside the water. You used to hate these weekends, Benzos admitted. I didn't hate them. You tolerated them. I hated pretending I had to shrink myself to fit in. Benzos looked at her. I'm sorry. For what? For not noticing. Lilian studied him. You notice now. I should have noticed sooner. The apology landed differently this time. No defensiveness, no excuses, just accountability. As the evening settled around them, Benzos watched people seek Lilian. Out naturally. They laughed with her, asked questions, valued her perspective. The woman some had once underestimated had never needed changing. She only needed space to be fully herself. And quietly, without speeches or revenge, justice arrived. Not through embarrassment, not through bitterness, but through recognition. Because the people who once saw Lilian as someone standing beside a billionaire had finally begun to understand something Benzos had, learned the hard way. She had never belonged in his shadow. She had always deserved to stand beside him. Several weeks later, Benzos asked Lilian to meet him at the office tower in Birmingham. Not in the boardroom, not in his private office, not in the place where people shook his hand and waited for. Instructions. He asked her to meet him on the rooftop. When Lilian stepped out, the evening air touched her face gently. The Alabama skyline stretched around them, glowing with traffic, office, lights, and the quiet movement of a city that kept living even when people inside it were trying to heal. Benzos stood near the railing. For a moment, Lilian said nothing. This was the same building where everything had changed. The same place where his body had given out. The same place where people who once saw him as untouchable watched him fall. You brought me back here? She asked softly. Benzos turned. I needed to stand here without pretending I was fine. Lilian walked closer, careful but calm. That's new for you, I know. He looked out over Birmingham before facing her fully. For years, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was losing control of my company, my reputation, or my future. Lilian listened. But when I woke up in that hospital, he continued, and saw you sitting there, I realized I had already lost something bigger. I lost the woman who knew me before all the rooms got crowded. Her eyes softened, but she stayed quiet. Benzos took a breath. I told myself we drifted apart because life got busy. That sounded easier than admitting the truth. What truth? That I stopped showing up. Lilian blinked slowly. He continued. I came home, but I wasn't present. I provided, but I didn't listen. I loved you, but I made you feel like you had to wait your turn behind. Meetings, calls, dinners, and people who barely knew me. Lilian looked away for a moment. Those words touched old wounds, but they did not reopen them cruelly. They gave them names. Benzos stepped closer, leaving enough space for her to choose whether to stay. I'm sorry, Lilian. Her voice was quiet. I needed those words years ago. I know. I needed you to fight for us before papers were on a table. I know. I needed you to notice when I stopped asking. His face tightened with regret. I should have. Lilian folded her arms, not in anger, but protection. I wasn't perfect either. I acted strong because I didn't want to beg my husband for attention. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken sooner. But Benzos, I was tired. I understand now. Do you? She asked. He nodded slowly. I understand enough to know apologies don't erase what happened. That answer surprised her. He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a ring, not for a gift, not for anything expensive, just a small folded paper. Lilian looked at it. What is that? My new schedule. She stared at him. You brought me a schedule? It has doctor visits, rest days, community commitments, and no meeting evenings. Despite herself, Lilian almost smiled. You are trying to romance me with calendar discipline? I'm working with my strengths. A soft laugh escaped her. Benzos smiled briefly, then became serious again. I'm not asking for another chance because I got scared in a hospital bed. He looked into her eyes. I'm asking because losing you was the biggest mistake I never had the courage to admit. Lilian's eyes filled with emotion. Benzos held out his hand but did not touch her first. No pressure, no pretending, no rushing. His voice lowered. Just one honest question, Lilian whispered. What question? Will you let me earn another chance? Lilian stared at Benzos for several seconds. The Birmingham skyline stretched around them, but neither of them seemed aware of anything beyond the space they shared. Years of memories sat between them. Some beautiful, some painful, all real. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't trying to persuade, explain, or solve. Benzos didn't interrupt her silence. He simply waited. Finally, Lilian looked at him. If I say yes, she said carefully, I need you to understand something. I do. No, listen first. Benzos nodded immediately. Lilian drew in a slow breath. I don't want another marriage built on assumptions. You won't have one. I don't want to compete with schedules. You won't. I don't want us pretending everything is fine when it isn't. Benzos swallowed. You won't. Lilian's voice softened. I never stopped loving you, Benzos. His eyes widened. But love wasn't our problem. A tear slipped down her cheek. We stopped talking. Benzos closed his eyes briefly. She continued. We stopped telling each other when we were disappointed, when we were overwhelmed, when we felt lonely. We expected the other person to notice without saying anything. She looked directly at him. So I have one condition. Anything. We never stop talking. Benzos didn't hesitate. Deal. A shaky laugh escaped Lilian. You didn't even ask what that means. It means hard conversations. It means honesty. It means saying we're hurting before resentment settles in. It means asking for help. It means listening. Benzos smiled through tears gathering in his eyes. Then it's the easiest deal I've ever made. This time, when he held out his hand, Lilian placed hers in it. Months later, people gathered to witness something few believed they would ever see. Family members arrived early. Church members filled the seats with joyful anticipation. Employees who had only known Benzos as a demanding executive stood quietly nearby. Business associates exchanged surprised glances. There were no grand displays designed to impress strangers. No attempt to rewrite history. Only truth. Benzos looked at Lilian with the same nervous affection he had carried, years earlier when he first asked her to marry him. You still can't dance, Lilian whispered. I've had years to improve. You haven't. That hurts, she laughed. I know. Benzos took her hands. I can't promise perfection. I don't want perfection, Lilian replied. I can promise presence. I can promise honesty. I can promise to choose you intentionally. Lilian squeezed his hands. And I can promise to speak instead of staying silent. I can promise forgiveness without pretending pain never existed. I can promise friendship. Emotion filled Benzos' voice. You've always been my greatest blessing. Lilian smiled through tears. And you've always been worth fighting for when you remember what matters. As they renewed their vows, applause echoed around them. Not because they had a perfect love story, but because they had a true one. They had learned that love rarely disappears all at once. It weakens when neglected. It strengthens through attention. Success can build companies and provide opportunities, but emotional presence builds trust. Being admired by many isn't the same as being understood by one. Person who knows your fears, flaws, and habits. Pride closes doors that humility can reopen. Forgiveness asks for courage. Respect doesn't require revenge. And choosing each other isn't a single decision made at an altar. It's a choice repeated in ordinary moments. A conversation after a difficult day. A dinner protected from interruptions. A hand reached out before distance grows too wide. Benzos once believed becoming a billionaire was his greatest achievement. But standing beside Lilian, he finally understood something wealth had never taught him. His greatest blessing had been the woman who sat beside his hospital bed when she had every reason to walk away. And this time, neither of them let go. Before we say goodbye, family, if this story touched your heart, please let us know in the comments. Do you believe love deserves a second chance when both people are willing to grow? Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to Love, Money, and Secrets so you never miss another unforgettable story filled with hope, wisdom, and heart. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, take care of the people you love before life reminds you how precious they truly are.